It's been a really amazing 2 days for the first Human Cell Atlas Africa Symposium. And this is really our closing remarks. We've had some really great panel discussions over the last hour or so. And emerging from one of those panel discussions was a question that one of my friends and colleagues from HCA wanted to ask to Nikki Mulder. So we have Alex Shalik, and he's going to ask his question here during our closing remarks. Go ahead, Alex.
Nikki, the question that I had for you in the previous session that just came up in the Ask Me Anything is, what do you think are the best ways for the HCA to work with organizations like H3 Africa and all of the incredible infrastructure that Christian and others have built to really, help catalyze some of the single cell efforts on the continent? As was brought up, we have no desire to reinvent the wheel. We'd love to think about ways to best support ongoing science. And so, as you've seen things through here and heard the discussion, I'd love sort of your feedback on where would you begin? What do you think would be the most impactful?
Thanks, Alex. So we have actually had some of these sort of discussions in our sustainability group in H3 Africa, thinking what is H3 Africa built that could be leveraged for other activities. So the core resources, infrastructure resources, are the biobanks. So we have 3 biorepositories. And those are existing, and they function extremely well. One in Nigeria, one in South Africa, and one in Uganda. We have the bioinformatics network that I've been running, and then we have a coordinating center who sort of keeps all the activities together. So we can build on some of those infrastructures that have been built. And then we have Christian and some of the other groups research infrastructure in terms of the equipment, so the NGS facilities, and hopefully, extending that to more single cell facilities. So the other things that we've done in H3 Africa, which I think could be leveraged, are things like the data governance policies, so data sharing policies, how we ship samples around, how we ship data around, what are the access agreements, how do we ensure that when people share or use African samples or data, that there's some sort of benefit sharing involved? And so we've actually built quite a lot of policies and guidelines documents. And a lot of this was done by, careful analysis of working with ethics committees in research institutions, working with national ethics committees, looking at legislation in terms of what is allowed or not allowed in terms of data governance and data sharing. So I think there's no point in running all those sort of analyses again. Just build on what has been developed. But there's a framework for responsible sharing of samples and data that's been developed. There's return of results. So there are a lot of things when you're working with participants that H3 Africa has never fully solved, because it's always been a learning experience, but they've gone a long way to solving. And you don't want to go back and reinvent those wheels again. So I think there's a lot that can be built on in terms of the guidelines, documents, policies, engagement with these ethics boards and governments and the research community, but then also the infrastructure. The other thing, of course, is the training, which we talked about in the previous session. So I think, building on that, we can then think about an HCA an African HCA, where we have these researchers who can come in and use this infrastructure, or the people who have already got samples and maybe have consent, that would allow those samples to enter the HCA. There are a lot of, for every cohort that was analyzed in H3 Africa, there's a whole set of cases and a whole set of controls. So you've got your healthy controls covering, when you think about the H3 Africa chip, we're talking about more than 75,000 participants across Africa, covering multiple different African countries. So I think we've really got a rich resource of samples and data. So, yeah, that's quite a broad answer, but I think there's a lot of different components of H3 Africa and many other consortia as well that can be built on and leveraged for something like an African HCA.
Would you perhaps tell us a little bit about how you see, Alfred, coming out of this meeting and looking at the landscape of integration with different data sets, integration of, as you said, you're very interested in bioinformatics integration, how your work, the work you're doing in the Gambia on malaria could find its way into a broader acceleration of HCA participation in Africa? Since you're at the cutting edge of this, I think it's so important to hear from someone like you.
Yeah, thanks, Musa. And I think I'm not very far away from what Gordon is doing. So we do very similar stuff, even though he has a much wider platform. So yeah, absolutely, yes. We see ourselves getting into it because we beyond malaria, as I said, we're also part of the H3 Africa Consortium. And so we access in communities. We focus on malaria as a disease because that seems to be the most common disease. But you are aware, as I said in one of the opening remarks, that there is the environment that is defined by other diseases, and it's defined by non-disease factors that may contribute to disease. And so I'm looking at a situation where in our communities where we're doing malaria work, we've been able to access a large diversity in terms of human ethnicity. And we're plotting, for example, now our ethnic distributions, and we're seeing a very long tail of very small ethnic groups that have very clear differences with a small number of markers only. And these are people that needs to be included. So we think that with these, as Nicola said, we're providing a platform for resource, for access to these communities, for access to samples that H3 Africa can take advantage. HCA can take advantage of. And I'd see secondly that the HCA, obviously, as Alec has mentioned, can participate in some of the capacity building activities, which we are already doing well enough, as I said. But I'd say my catchwords here are broadening the base. So it's not about Alfred, it's about those that we are training. And building the platform for this to work, really, we need to sustain the early and middle career scientists to have the interest in these activities, because they're the ones that are going to support the slightly more senior scientists like myself, as well as encourage the younger upcoming scientists that are like PhD students or slightly younger like MSc students to gain interest in these activities, to get interest in the science and to push it forward. So I have been very excited listening to the sessions in the last and the talks and some of the presentations from PhD students and other well-known scientists on this. And I see myself in a situation where in the next few years, we want to get on this as we get more engaged in human genetic diversity work. So I'm delighted being part of this family. Thanks, Musa.
Thanks. That's a really great answer. Christian has joined us, and I want to take you back to 2 sessions ago, Christian. You raised a really interesting point that they are different partners that you've been able to work with to build what I think is a really exciting genomics platform and has contributed tremendously to our understanding of really very lethal and dangerous viruses and pathogens. And my question is the following. To what extent does the type of partner you have influence the economic benefits and sustainability of basically the creation of these genomics platforms in Africa? And the reason I ask that is I think on almost every single panel so far, we've had the conversation on expensive reagents. We've had the conversation on basically access to economic resources. And we've also had the conversation on economic resources linked to brain drain. So it would almost seem like Africa has to build its own sustainable economic platforms that can sustain this type of work. And Christian, I'm really curious to get your thoughts on this, since you've built an extensive genomics platform. And as you said, the number of genomes now, from a population genetics point of view, through your efforts and Nikki's efforts, have expanded to almost 100,000 African genomes, which is unprecedented 2 years ago. So I'm very, very interested in knowing what your thoughts are in terms of economic sustainability, because it seems that many of these questions that we're talking about here need to kind of ride on that.
I do think that, first of all, is that there is a need for more investment from African countries, from African, and then from African institutions, and then the private sector. The only way we're going to drive down the cost and then make things a little bit more cheaper for Africa is actually to build that critical mass and then start using the technologies and then doing this work. And by the time you start doing this work, we can also start leveraging our togetherness to drive down the cost. I give you instances. One thing I've learned in the course of this COVID is the fact that if you have the resources and then you are doing good work, you can absolutely drive down the cost by telling the same people that tell you it's impossible. They will see the value into what you do and then start saying, how can we work together, and then how can we partner. And then you can start telling them that your cost is very high, and then they can bring down the cost. I think we need to do much more than what we're doing now, building a critical mass, but we need to own this process. And the ownership of the process requires that our government actually invest more into what we're doing and have them believe in what we're doing. What I've noticed in the context of COVID is the fact that I think that it has shown African government the value of this technology. And most of them have gone ahead to buy this platform because they could see the value and then the application and the impact of this technology. Now, the next step for the human cell and the single cell is actually to start demonstrating to them that if we've been able to do this for infectious diseases and help use this to curb, epidemics and pandemic, we can basically use single cell to understand diseases that are very peculiar to Africa, and especially relating the, single cell to, infectious disease, looking at this interaction and see how we can use this technology in order to provide for solution much more faster than we believe. I think Africa has come to a point where they start realizing that Africa health security is very important, on the investment done on the continent, both by government and then the private sector. If you read the article that I published in Nature with John Kengerson in January, that article really had a resounding effect because I got calls from many ministers of health and many ministers of health across the continent. And I was privileged to have a meeting with an African head of state because I never knew that, they could have such report because they could see, see the fact that we were basically arguing and advocating the fact that Africa health security would depend on Africans. And one of the things that we can actually use to accelerate Africa health security is going to be genomics, not only for pathogen genomics, but also human genomics, because there is a huge opportunity there, in order not even just to sit back and let the world. We have the opportunity as Africans now to lead, to take the driver's seat. As I argued before, pathogens are part of our biodiversity. We are very rich about it. In terms of the same diversity, the human genome in Africa is very rich, and we have the potential to harness the richness into it in order to drive, the world. And therefore, as my argument has always been that we need to do more of this and then drive down the cost.
Alex, I have a question specifically for you. I hope you're on with us. And my question is along the lines of what the HCA is doing in the context of Nikki's answer around population genomics and in terms of diversity, and in terms of what kind of metrics are we interested in developing within the HCA that are sort of demonstrative of our commitment to enlarge geographic and genetic diversity in building different human cell atlases. And I think this is really important in this context in our closing remarks for this audience.
When I think about metrics, I think about metrics in three regards, and this sort of comes from the equity hat that you and I both wear. One is really around measuring diversity of the samples that exist within the HCA, as we think about it in terms of representation. And we've been working with CCI and with others actively to think about what are appropriate metrics and how we would monitor those. In some places, lack of reference makes it hard to figure out how diverse our atlases truly are. So it's fantastic to hear about all of the efforts that are going into profiling African genomes so that we can use those as a way of understanding what we're capturing and what we're not capturing. And we hope to have some elements there that we can follow up on and monitor, because although it won't be good to start, things that matter are monitored and tracked. And so we need to know how we're doing, and we need to make sure that we continue to improve. But the things that I'm more personally interested in are not just representation, but come back to the ideas of participation and data benefit. I think that there's always a big push to get a wide variety of samples into a database. But, one of the things that I personally think is critical, and I know a number of people do as well, is, empowering individuals so that they can be active participants in generating data and analyzing data and thinking about how we might get additional support for that. And, there are some metrics that we've started thinking about in terms of, tracking where individuals are coming from on publications, trying to monitor that over time, thinking about who's contributing, who's using data when they go into repositories. But, we need things that are more comprehensive and that do a better job. And so would be open to any suggestions there. And then the hardest one for me is data benefit. And I think it gets back to some of the things that Christian was just talking about, like about how impactful the data can be with respect to, understanding of infectious diseases. I understand that the Human Cell Atlas is a healthy reference, but I also know that, we're very often thinking about disease versus health. And so I've always pushed that we need to have both, the disease samples and the healthy references that go with them. And that, one without the other isn't necessarily everything we need. So I would say that, a big emphasis that we'd like to figure out is like, how do we actually track who's getting benefit and how they're getting benefit? I think with the trainees, we can think about who's included on papers, how some of this data goes into sort of the advancement of their careers, presentations and the like. But, more generally, how this goes back to the community. And when it goes back to the community is something that, we're trying to think our way through. And any suggestions people have on ways that we could monitor and track that would be extremely valuable, because it's one of the most nebulous things, but also to me, one of the most important, because the goal really here is to create a reference that helps, enhance human health. And so we have to figure out how we're going to quantify the real tangible good that comes from this. Just my 2 cents, and open to anybody else's thoughts.
Thank you very much for that, Alex. Any thoughts on that? Alfred, Nikki, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, thanks. So I agree. And, I think the thing about the healthy references is not sexy to study. People need to study diseases, and so governments would fund disease research. But if we had some examples from HCA, and, I'm sure there are many, of how that healthy reference has actually led to a diagnosis, a better understanding of diseases, and we can present those to the governments and present those to the African researchers and say, well, it's not all about just studying the disease state. We need to think about what is a healthy reference. So I think some examples. And in terms of getting people involved, we often get asked, why do African researchers not use data that's in the public, in public repositories? And it's usually because it's not relevant, because there are not enough African data in those public repositories. So if we build that up, I think we can create some research projects for all the bioinformatics students who are looking for data to work on. And get them excited about single cell, and then that'll then lead to new single cell experiments.
We have a very strong need to be able to basically measure these outcomes, and people don't really care about the things that they don't measure. One of the largest impediments to us understanding integrating some of the population genetics and the basically healthy atlas, and some of the points that Nikki has brought up in her earlier remarks, is that we're just unsure of how to quantify the extent of diversity that exists in Africa. And I think in building our atlases in Africa, even if they're disease reference atlases, they kind of collide with the fact that we're not very sure of who we're actually sampling in terms of the strata of the African population. And we know the population is extremely diverse, but we're not sure whether a specific disease is manifesting in a way that's unique to that strata in Africa. And I think even when we build these atlases, that becomes an issue for us to be able to really understand from a benefit point of view in Africa what we're working with. And so I think for us, all here on this panel, who want to advance genomics, and especially single cell genomics, this is one of our key problems in terms of the depth knowledge that we have of the diversity of the African genome. Christian, do you have you had a remark? Sorry, I may have cut you off.
Yeah, I was saying that the way we need to approach it, especially depending on depending on where we want to do this, is that context matters. And in order to get the buy-in for the community, I think we need to really use this technology and then use this approach to science to address to address problems that are affecting people. Use this technology and this approach to help to address local problem in the context of Africa. Some of those things are infectious disease, but how do you create a link and then use this technology to address, infectious diseases, but also we're having a whole lot of non-communicable diseases. One other thing that we need to think about is actually the diversity of African population and also the way some of the disease, manifest, in the context of Africa. If you look at COVID and then the way it went across the globe, you will realize that, no matter what people say, I'm working in this space, there is something in Africa that is unique and that made Africans actually either dodge or be more protected for this disease than others. It is clear that we are not, the case fatality rate and then the morbidity of the disease is very different here. So these are some of the things, that we can actually use this technology and then this approach to explore. And if we were using things like of this nature that are immediately relevant to the policymaker in Africa, they will see the relevance to it, and then we can pivot to other things like non-communicable diseases and things, using this as a way to really present the different populations or the African population in a way that, policymakers will use to make, rational decisions that are very important to move the science forward. And that's how the investment can come in.
Who do we have next? I think, Alfred, you go ahead.
So what I was saying, I think we need to go back and then think about an ecosystem for science development, especially with these new technologies. And that ecosystem for science development has to be married with an ecosystem for its translation into health benefits, directly being medicine for Africa or medicine for the globe. So there is an ecosystem that needs to really be accessed and discussed, and it will require investment in people and in infrastructure and in politics. And the investment in politics is going to be extremely important for this to be translated. So we can have all the discussions we can have here. The investment in politics is something that we need to take more seriously. I know this has come up in the H3 Africa Forum, where there are dedicated groups of individuals looking at engagement of stakeholders and engagement of communities. So we need to consider these really seriously as we take these discussions forward. That's my last comment. Thanks.
Nikki, any thoughts you may have?
Just the last comment to say that I think this meeting has been great, and I hope we can keep the momentum and build a community of people in Africa who are interested in single cell. The technology just offers amazing opportunities, and I think it's the young mid-career groups that we need to build up to get excited about these new technologies and really use these to harness harness the data that's coming out of them, so that we can really have novel discoveries for health in Africa. But the partnerships need to be equitable. So we need to have equal partnerships between the African researchers and the HCA, which I know the diversity group's been really cognizant of. So I look forward to closer collaboration with the HCA and African scientists.
Alex, any last remarks you want to make?
I think it's fantastic that we've had our first HCA Africa meeting. It's been illuminating for me for the sessions that I was able to join. And all it makes me wish is that we weren't in a period of COVID and we could be there in person, and that we were following this up with some hands-on training. Everything that's on my mind right now that's spinning is, how do we do stuff now? When can we be there in person? Because, I think listening to the points that were raised, there clearly is demand, and it would be a shame if we were not rising to meet that demand and trying to train as many people as possible. And I know that, as Partha brought up, there was a workshop that was hosted at his institute that we did in collaboration with our lab and others at MIT. Would love to do something like that, but he said to me, there were 1,000 people that signed up and we could only host 200. And I said, why didn't we figure out how to host 1,000 people? And he thought I was insane. But I think we have to figure out how we're going to do those sorts of things, because it feels like these things are catalytic. As you get more people involved, it builds its own momentum. And that's really, if I think about what's happened over the past several years, it was a small number of people that gathered originally. And it was the fact that, it snowballed, that more and more people got involved. And we just have to figure out how to make it snowball in various places and what we can do to make sure that happens. So I'm looking forward to working with everybody here, and to anybody that wants to contact me to figure out how to get that going. That's what's on my mind.
Thank you so much, Alex. Christian, you get the last word before we officially close this first HCA Africa Symposium.
I just want to say thank you, Musa, and then all of everyone for organizing. I mean, this it's been incredible. And I want to say that we're very happy, and then from our own end here is SK to really join and then to support in this effort, to build a capacity and then to work together to really build that critical mass and build some new aspirations for young African scientists in a way that, they will see the power behind this technology and then translate this technology also into things that could revolutionize the way we are approaching care, or approaching science, that can be impactful on health on the continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christian. Thank you to all of you. And I just really want to thank our organizing committee that has spent really a lot of time looking for scientists in this particular work of single cell biology, are tremendously talented speakers who've come and spoken to us from all over the world, but mainly from Africa. I mean, we've been exposed to a lot of young African talent. We've been also really grateful to be able to see how Africa really needs just very little to be able to catalyze. And when I say catalyze, really catalyze this new and nascent field of biology that will allow us to be able to get Africa being a really equal and powerful partner in the HCA. And we've had amazing speakers, as you can see here in these slides. We've had people like Parta. We've had people from Brazil like Patricia. We've had Alfred from the Gambia. We had Musa and Ido from West Africa and from Nigeria. And really, we've also had great discussions on ethics and equity, which I think have been so important. We've had fundamental research from the likes of Dorrit Hochman. We've had really the development of new platforms that have been spoken to us from people like Nikki Tiffin. So I really want to thank all of you for your participation. A lot of support from the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative has made this possible, and has made it possible for us to have so many people involved in this particular forum. Thank you for being here for Africa. Thank you.